What a Strange Little Colt. Written by Linwood. Chapter 8. Flashes. Part 1. Monday morning. Weekends always felt short. Sunday came and went in a blink, and once again, Sweetie Belle was back at her uncomfortable wooden desk, groggy from being dragged out of her bed by her older sister, because she and the girls had stayed up too late crusading again. They'd invited the new Colt, but he had politely declined, stating that he wanted to spend the day indoors. Scootaloo had called him a weirdo. Even though the morning light streaming in through the schoolhouse's windows was warm and cheery, every fool around her carried the same half-tired, half-annoyed look on their faces as they sat there waiting for the school day to start. Even Miss Cheerilee looked unenthusiastic as she shuffled through the papers on her desk.
I miss summer vacation.
The filly rested her head on her folded forelegs. Fools streamed into the classroom in ones and twos. Sweetie was always early. Rarity hated when she wasn't, and as such she was always the first of the crusaders to find her seat. Apple Bloom came in next, bearing bags under her eyes and a mistied bow. Scoots followed a few minutes afterward, nodding to her friends and plopping down on her desk with a yawn.
Looks like the hedgehog she uses to brush her mane was extra mad today.
Then Rainbow Dash entered the room, rousing Sweetie's eyes. There, trailing behind her, was Gabriel, wearing a set of saddlebags over his bandaged middle. The unicorn glanced at Scootaloo, who sank lower in her desk and glowered at her hooves. Rainbow Dash and Gabriel walked over to Cheerilee, who stood up and greeted them warmly. Sweetie couldn't tell what they were saying from her spot near the back, but her teacher nodded along with whatever Rainbow was saying. Then she said something back and Dash nodded, and then she led both to the vacant desk in the front row that hadn't been there last week, nearest to hers. She watched Gabriel as he unbuckled his saddlebag with a fumbling hoof, letting them fall to the floor before nudging them underneath the desk. Rainbow Dash said her goodbyes and trotted out the door, leaving Miss Cheerilee to talk to Gabriel for a while. By now, most of the other fools had arrived, and were watching a new Colt with the bored half-interest of those who have nothing better to look at. The last to walk in was Diamond, whose face twisted in disapproval once she spotted the class's newest member. They locked eyes for a bare moment before she rolled hers and trotted over to her normal desk. A few minutes later, the clock ticked to the hour, and it was time to start class. Miss Cheerilee stood up and walked to the front room.
Good morning, every pony,
she announced. Good morning, Miss Cheerilee, came the tired, scripted reply from every foal but Gabriel.
As you may have noticed, we have a new student with us today.
She looked at Gabriel, encouragingly, and beckoned him with a hoof. He got out of his chair and walked to the front of the classroom, brushing some of his light green mane out of his eyes.
This is Gabriel, and he's new in town, so I expect you all to be as warm, welcoming, and as friendly as I know you can be.
As she spoke, the little Colt looked out over the classroom like he was looking at the cover of a somewhat interesting book. If he cared that many of the other foals began whispering to each other about when they heard his name, he didn't show it.
Gabriel, can you tell the class something about yourself?
Hi, I'm Gabriel, but you can call me Gabe if you want, he said with a wave. I come from really far away.
Thank you, Gabriel. You may return to your seat.
He nodded at her and quickly did so.
Okay, class. Today we're going to learn about the beginning of the Middle Period.
Sweetie Belle stuck her tongue out.
Gross history.
All around her, foals were making similar expressions. She did her best to pay attention as Miss Cheerilee began to talk about the long-gone ponies she'd never even meet were doing 500 years ago. Her ears perked up when she heard the rustle of paper. Heads turned towards the new foal as he retrieved a notebook from his saddlebags, as well as a pencil. He flipped open the notebook and began to write in not with his mouth, but with his hoof, contrary to everything she had been taught. The foal stuck the pencil in his fetlock and began carefully tracing out jagged letters one by one. Sweetie couldn't help but to stare.
That's so slow. Does he not know how to write normally?
Cheerilee began talking about the Griffonian invasion, which was a relief because that was something every pony knew about. They'd all heard the story. Griffins, as was common knowledge, had lived in the mountain lands to the north for 700 years after their ancestors colonized it from the Griffin homelands across the ocean. 500 years ago, the evil king decided he wanted a piece of Equestria and invaded. Only by working together were the ponies able to stop the Griffin tribes and push him back into the north, reclaiming all the towns that the evil king had captured. After they had lost, the Griffins overthrew him. It was a story they had all been told before, so Sweetie expected the lesson to be just about as boring as it could possibly be. She did notice, every so often, that Gabriel would look down and scratch something onto his notebook. He ended up writing down a lot. Before she knew it, he had covered a whole page. Of course, just as Miss Cheerily got to the part about the griffins deposing the bad king, Gabriel raised his hoof. The teacher stopped and blinked, not expecting a question on such a well-known story.
Yes, Gabe? Were the griffins united when they invaded Equestria?
Cheerily looked surprised for a moment.
Yes, I believe they were. Did King Grimmer unite the tribes himself?
Sweetie couldn't help but to roll her eyes at the asinine question.
Duh, of course not. Everybody knows that he was a bad king.
What kind of living under a rock pony didn't know this? Her teacher blinked again, then smiled at the question.
Why, no, he did not. That was one of his predecessors. Thanks.
Gabriel went back to writing poorly in his notebook.
Now then, where were... Yes, Gabriel?
Nico put his hoof back down.
Did the Griffin tribe stay united after they overthrew their king?
Sweetie blinked, then shook her head. They definitely did, because Griffinstone was still one kingdom today.
Actually, they didn't,
Miss Cheerily said, patiently.
What? With no clear heir, the tribes turned on themselves and broke apart. It would take an especially brave and noble leader, King Grover, to unite the tribes 2.5 centuries later.
Thanks. Gabe scratched his notebook some more. Miss Cheerily finished the lesson without any more interruptions, and then it was time for math.
I hope you all did the reading I assigned over the weekend.
Sweetie groaned as she and every other foal dragged their math book out of their saddlebags and plopped on their desks. It wasn't that she was bad at math. She was actually just fine in it, and often helped her friends with their homework. It was just that learning the math was boring.
It's a good thing nobody ever does those readings. She just goes over it in class anyway, so there's no reason to.
She opened the geometry portion of her book and waited for her teacher to start. After opening her textbook, the pink main teacher wrote down a weird-looking symbol on the chalkboard and turned around, pointing to the board with a hoof.
All right, who can tell me what this symbol is?
The squiggly set of lines rang a bell, but Sweetie couldn't quite place where she had seen it before. The class was dead silent. She saw a certain dark green Colt look around the room before sticking his hoof up.
Yes, Gabriel? Is it called pie?
He asked. Chili smiled.
Correct. This is the unicornian letter pi. Hey, how do you know that?
Sweetie stared at Gabe. He shrugged back. The teacher fixed a disapproving look upon the class.
Now, I hope you all didn't answer because you're still feeling groggy. That was in the weekend reading.
He wrote a short name next to the squiggly symbol, and Gabe wrote down something in his notebook.
We use pi to help us know things about circles, like how long the outside is or how much space is inside of them.
He drew a big lopsided circle besides pi.
For example, we know that circumference, or the distance as if you were walking around the outside of the circle, is found like this.
Miss Shirley wrote a weird bit of math on the chalkboard. C equals 2 times pi times r.
From what we learned last week, we know that this is an equation. Can anybody tell me why we can't solve this equation yet?
Hootie scratched up her muzzle. She thought she knew why, but she didn't want to raise her hoof.
What if I'm wrong? I don't want to look dumb.
Gabe raised his hoof again, but this time Miss Cheerily didn't call on him right away.
Any pony else?
Hootie swallowed and slowly raised her foreleg in the air.
Yes, Sweetie Belle. Is it because you can't multiply numbers with letters? Exactly right. Very good, Sweetie.
Sweetie's heart soared.
We can't simply because we don't know what the numbers pi and r are standing in for. Now, finding this is fairly simple. We'll look at r before we tackle pi.
The teacher drew a line from the center to the edge of her wobbly circle and wrote r over it.
The distance from the center of the circle to part its outside is called the radius. When we do calculations with the radius, we let r stand in for it, because writing radius every time would get annoying. There's a radius for every circle, so in this case, let's say the circle has a radius of 4.
She wrote a equals 4 next to her r. Sweetie noticed that Gabe didn't write that in his notebook.
But we can't do our equation yet because we don't know what to put in for pi. Can anybody tell me?
She looked over at the class. The green hoof raised up.
Let somebody else answer this one, Gabriel.
The hoof lowered and no pony spoke up.
This was all in the reading,
Cheerily said, sounding disappointed. Still no foals raised their hoof, and the teacher sighed.
Alright, Gabriel. What does pi stand for? Pi is an irrational number,
he said, sounding as confident as Miss Cheerily. Sweetie tilted her head.
What's an irrational number? It's the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter in its infinitely long non-repeating decimal, so it's easier just to approximate it with a 3.14 or a 22 divided by 7 if you really like fractions.
Most of Gabriel's answers went straight over Sweetie's head.
What's its diameter? How can a number be infinitely long?
Miss Shirley made another heavier sigh.
That's a little beyond our scope of our lesson, but yes. We usually let 3.14 stand in for pi, but it's actually much longer. Ponies know pi to about the 500 number or so, but some mathematicians say that it goes on forever. For our problems, just think of pi as 3.14.
She wrote the new equation on the board below the old one. C equals 2 times 3.14 times 4. The rest of the lesson went much like the first part. Shirley would ask a question and only very rarely would somebody other than Gabe answer. The Colt was some kind of math whiz. He knew the answer to every question and could do big multiplications in his head. He calculated the whole first equation without even writing anything down. After they had figured out the circumferences and areas of what seemed like 100 circles, recess time finally rolled around. All the fools immediately leapt up as if they had been electrocuted, completely unrecognizable from the classroom's lethargic, slightly annoyed state of 10 minutes ago. Sweetie Belle stood up and walked over to Apple Bloom and Scootaloo, intending to follow them for the door. She was going to wait for Gabe too, but he walked up to Miss Cheerily instead of bolting to the door like every other foal.
Excuse me, teacher. Can I ask you a few things about the middle period? Is he serious?
Sweetie almost couldn't believe what she was seeing. Miss Shirley frowned and tilted her head.
Don't you want to go outside and play? I could take it or leave it. I'm more curious about this griffin invasion. Tell me, were there northern ranges colonized by one of the overseas nations or several?
Scootaloo stuck her tongue out.
Come on, girls. Let's go. You can catch up if you want.
The three trotted through the schoolhouse door into the late summer day. The air was warm and comfortable, and overhead the weather teams were still getting ready for the coming thunderstorm. The trio followed the tail end of the class and walked around the side of the building to the playground, where most of the foals had begun to talk or play. In an unspoken habit, the three fillies found a spot away from the other foals and sat down. Sweetie Belle coughed.
So, that Colt is a real egghead.
Scoots raised an indignant eyebrow.
How do you know so much about all that math?
Apple Bloom shrugged.
Maybe they just really liked math where he's from? I mean, he would just not stop answering questions. He even read the reading and made us all look bad. No pony reads the reading. Yeah, that is kinda weird,
Sweetie Belle said.
But it was like he didn't know anything about all the griffin history stuff. Yeah,
Apple Bloom.
That's almost like not knowing about the princesses or apples.
She bit her lip.
He's weird. And AJ thinks so too. Huh?
Sweetie Belle tilted her head.
What'd she say? She said that he was polite enough, but something about him was...
She furrowed her brow, working to summon the exact memory.
It was when we was walking home from the party. She said...
A bloom popped up her cheeks and deepened her voice.
There's something odd about that Colt. He ain't a liar, but he ain't exactly honest neither. Yeah, your crush is weird as heck,
Scootaloo said, smirking at the unicorn filly. Immediately, Sweetie let her face grow hot as she fixed a pointed look at her orange friend.
Our soon-to-be new member is weird as heck,
she insisted.
Hey, I'm not the one that couldn't keep my eyes off of him. Yeah?
Apple Bloom said, apparently joining in on the fun.
Every time I looked over, you were staring at the Colt.
Sweetie Belle groaned and dropped to her belly, laying her muzzle on the grass and covering her face.
I don't have a crush on him. Just saying. Can we please not talk about this anymore?
Her friends eased off. Thanks, Celestia, and they spent the rest of the break debating over what to crusade for after school. Amazingly, Gabriel still hadn't come outside by the time Cheerily called the class back in. Instead, he greeted them from his desk with a little wave when they re-entered the classroom. He did the same for Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon, which they appeared to find considerably unamusing. The day went on normally enough. Miss Cheerily taught lessons on science and social studies, peppered with weirdly specific questions from Gabe just like during history. The teacher dutifully answered each one, and by the end of the day every fool was rolling their eyes when that little green hoof went up into the air. Finally, after what seemed like an often interrupted eternity, Cheerily announced the school day officially over and set the foals loose. This time Gabe packed up like every pony else, tossing his notebook, pencils, and books into his bag and throwing him over his back. Then he trotted up to Sweetie and her friends, who awkwardly greeted him. He didn't seem to care.
That was weird as hell,
he said, not bothering to explain what hell was.
It's so strange to be back in grade school.
The four foals made their way outside with the others into the freedom of the afternoon full of possibilities.
So, Gabe,
Apple Bloom said to him as they trotted, giving him the name trademark Apple Twang.
We're gonna have to give you a good and proper initiation into the Crusaders, so... Hey, Gab, wait up!
Diamond's shrill, sarcastic call drew the heads of nearly every foal in front of the schoolyard.
Oh, Celestia, not again.
Sweetie's muzzle scrunched as she saw Gabe frown to himself for a moment. Then the brief annoyed look disappeared and he turned around.
Oh, what's up, Diamond? Feeling persistent today?
He said, friendly as ever.
And it's Gabe, by the way. My bad, Gab.
Diamond sounded far too sweet as she cantered up to the foursome, trailed by, of course, her gray hench pony.
I just want to know why the new Colt, of every pony, decided to make every pony else in the class look bad.
Her tone was still sugary enough to make Sweetie's stomach flip in distaste. Gabriel tilted his head to the side.
What do you mean? I mean how you answered all those questions nonstop like a self-centered nerd, of course.
Diamond covered her giggle with a huff.
Why, it made all of us look terrible. You don't have to make every pony around you look dumb just because you're a little better at math than the rest of the class.
Sweetie heard a few annoyed agreements and shouts of, yeah, what the hey, from the other foals as they shuffled into a rough circle around the two. Diamond Tiara smiled and raised her head a little higher, bolstered by the small crowd's support. Sweetie leaned into Scootaloo.
This is gonna get ugly fast if we don't do anything.
Her friend huffed.
He knows how mean DT is. If he didn't want this to happen, he wouldn't have been such a goody two-shoes to Miss Cheerily.
Before Sweetie could speak, Gabe shrugged and responded to Diamond Tiara in that perfectly calm and easy tone of his.
Hey, sorry to make you feel that way. I didn't mean to make you all look bad. I'm just trying to find my footing in class. I don't know everything that you all do.
His verbal assailant snickered.
Well, you don't have to tell us that. Besides math, you don't know anything. I mean, who doesn't know where Yakistan even is?
Sweetie Belle elected not to mention that she had known the kingdom's location for approximately 1 month.
I didn't realize that was an important thing to know. Oh, you poor thing.
The Earth Pony mocked.
A Colt like you must be, special. Are you sure you didn't get put in our class by mistake?
Yep. Gabe's stony interior seemed uncracked, and his voice sounded lazily friendly, but Sweetie Belle couldn't glean any idea of what the Colt really thought out of the one-sided conversation.
Well, in that case, I think... Sorry, Diamond, but I really don't care what you think.
To the surprise of nearly every filly and colt surrounding the two, Gabe stuck his hoof in front of her face, sharply interrupting whatever nasty thing was in the process of falling out of her mouth.
I'm hungry, and I haven't eaten since breakfast, so if you don't mind, I'm gonna go find a hay dog stand.
Then he turned and began to walk away. Once Diamond had finished flapping her mouth like a fish, she trotted up behind Gabriel, and the whole class moved around them.
Gabriel, don't you know how interrupting another pony while she's speaking is rude? I do, in fact, know that, he replied, staring straight ahead. Then you know what happens to rude little foals?
Diamond raised a hoof.
They get punished.
The stuck-up brat slapped her hoof across the back of Gabriel's head hard, and instantly got the response she so desperately wanted. Gabe spun around much quicker than Sweetie thought him capable of, and she watched as Diamond's expression snapped from the smug satisfaction to stone-cold fear. It all happened in the blink of an eye. Gabriel had a look in his half-glazed eyes, one that Sweetie had never seen on the face of another pony before in her entire life. It was different from the righteous or indignant anger that she saw on the faces of the heroes and villains in comics books. It was different from the frenzied fury on her big sister's face when she tracked mud on the rug, or that one time she ruined her best fabric. No. The emotion consuming this Colt's entire being instantly turned Sweetie's blood to ice, because it was the most cold, absolute, definite rage that she had ever seen. And it scared her so bad that the only feeling that made it through her head was relief that it was not directed at her. Gabe smashed his hoof straight into Diamond's cheek, slapping her head back and sending her stumbling. She didn't even have time to cry out before he struck her on the side of the head while sweeping his other foreleg against her own, forcing her to topple to the ground. She hit the dirt with flailing legs and a shell-shocked whimper, sending her namesake bouncing away. Without wasting a beat, Gabe reared back on his hind legs, his hoof above one of Diamond's forelegs, outstretched and popped up on the other. The glass gasped. Sweetie had the presence of mind to choke out,
Gabe, no!
The Colt brought his weight down with a lightning speed and produced a sickeningly crisp snap. Diamond's foreleg folded where he had struck it, between the wrist and the elbow, in a way that was so fundamentally wrong it made Sweetie want to throw up right then and there. Gabe raised his hoof, which left a weeping red crescent in her coat, and blinked at the filly's leg with wide, vacant eyes. Not noticing her blood dripping from his hoof at first, his eyes widened, his pupils shrunk, and his mouth parted with a soft "oh." Barely a few moments had passed. For a heartbeat, absolutely nothing happened. No pony said anything. The world stood still. Then Diamond raised her head, took one look at her leg, and began to scream. A lot of things happened very quickly. Every fool in the crowd began to shout. Miss Truly exploded out of the schoolhouse door and sprinted towards the small crowd, which immediately started to scatter. Fools began to make a run for it, some crying, some calling for help. Sweetie felt herself being yanked away from the scene. She blinked and realized that both Apple Bloom and Scootaloo had their forelegs around her neck.
Come on, Sweetie. We gotta get out of here.
Scootaloo shouted as they stumbled away.
This is gonna be bad.
Sweetie dumbly nodded and shot one final look at the terrifying Colt before she fled with her friends. Gabriel was still standing there, staring at his foreleg as if the entire universe consisted of himself, his hoof, and the blood that ran down its edge. Man, from the boring math section to this final part, day and night, and oh my gosh, I love doing that scene. I don't know. It's the sudden transformation from the really lightheartedness with tones of darkness we've had to just our boy just snapping, literally and metaphorically. Also, Diamond Tiara's leg, but that's besides the point. A little dark, but I also have a blooper. I'll put that at the end of this while the music's cutting out. But aside from that, I would like to thank my wonderful Patreons. Thank you, Chase Lemaster, Jason, Squall, Windfeather, 8th Day of Night, Starlight Blaze, Hyperlink, Night and Game, Rain Flicker, and Redeemer of Dark and Dreamless Portal. My tier 2, Captain Blueshadow, The Animated Ghost, HKH4, aka Texture, Sword Brother and Mordred, Danish Dash, Nocturne, DJMX 2000, Papa Lennon, and Canned Panzer. And finally, my Titan tiers, Dark Guardian, Maverick, and Silent Titan. I appreciate you guys' support so much, and it means a ton to me. That aside, however, this has been Firehearth. Have a wonderful day. Every fool around her carried the same half-tired, half-annoyed look on their voices. They carried the same half look on their voices. God, it's too early for this.